welcome. Nice to have you here. Today is our Relax into Health, Wealth, and Happiness meeting, and I'm going to try and experiment. I have what I'd like to do, and we'll see if it pans out. I would like to, over the next number of weeks, I'd like to explore some topics that could broadly be considered some principles, and these are principles for, call it, successful living. And my that much I think probably I can do. The part that we will be experimental is I'm going to attempt to have these transcribed and then to publish the transcriptions. So that will be the experimental part. But the somewhat non-experimental part is I'd like to explore over the coming weeks some principles for effective living, and we'll be starting today. And the topic that we'll start with today is what I'll call the Law of Correspondence. And so the Law of Correspondence, which we'll get into momentarily, and all of the principles that I'd like to explore in the coming weeks are something that we can explore and learn about. And the reason that I'm suggesting that we could do that and that would be useful to do is because it will help us to be happier and more efficient in our living, to be more on point, to know what we want, and to be more effective in achieving what we want, ultimately resulting in the health, wealth, and happiness that we would very, very much like to relax into. So that's the purpose of the exploration. And so, and I'm mentioning that because I think it's important to have that context. We could explore many principles. We could explore Newtonian physics, for example, and the principles of movement in the physical realm, and that might be interesting. But is that actually something that we really want? Maybe it is, but in my case, not so much. And so I'm proposing that the exploration of these principles will help us in our lives to be happier and wealthier and healthier. And I mean that sincerely. So with that said, let's start with the exploration of this first principle, which, as I've said, is the law of correspondence. So the law of correspondence is a name that I'm using to describe this principle, and it's a principle that seems to be known, we'll call it universally, among people who observe things carefully. And so it's been reported by a diverse range of people coming from different cultures. And so it's been described in different terms. One way that it's been described is I don't know if it's a maxim, we'll call it a maxim, the Hermetic maxim of as above, so below. And it's also been described that there's a correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm, or we could say the inner and the outer. And so this is the law of correspondence that I'd like to explore. So this law of correspondence says that there is a correspondence between the various dimensions of experience that we might imagine. So we might imagine those dimensions as being along various axes: above, below, inner, outer, larger, smaller, etc., etc. But however we divide our experience, the law of correspondence says to us that there is a correspondence between these various dimensions that we've divided or imagined to exist. So why would this be useful to us? Well, this would be useful to us if it's true, because it would point us to something that we could actually work with that would help us to have, as I've pointed or suggested, more efficacy in our lives, so that we're not spinning our wheels, wasting our time, and experiencing frustration. Instead, we can have a desire, or we can have the knowledge that we need in order to follow through on that desire, and then we can take the action in order to satisfy that desire. And so clearly, if we don't have access to truth, if we're living in ignorance, then we don't have the ability to achieve that kind of fulfillment, and so we end up feeling frustrated or victimized. And that's not a very good way to live. So I say, based on my experience, I've tried that. It didn't work very well. I imagine you've probably tried that as well, and you've probably found that it doesn't work so well to live in ignorance and frustration and so forth. And so when we can actually observe and work with something that we could call truthful, something that's verifiable, something that is reliable, then that allows us to be more effective, more efficient, and to achieve success instead of frustration. So let's look a little bit at this to see how this might be so, and see if we can start to actually discover how this is true in our lives and how this might be useful for us to see this. So I think that perhaps the most useful way the most useful dividing line that we could use would be a division between subjective and objective. Let me revise that. A useful way that we could divide our experience, or that we could see our experience divided, would be along this division line between subjective and objective. And so we have a sense of our subjective experience, we have a sense of an objective experience. Now, as I've talked about in the past, most of us are trained to think and perceive primarily objectively. And so a lot of our thinking is objective, whether we realize it or not. And the objective, meaning it's a focus on objects, a focus on conceiving of things as existing independent of one another and independent of a subject. So the sense is that I am a subject and I am interacting with objects. Other people would be objects in this case, as well as the things that we conventionally think of as objects. And in fact, also then our own experience, inner so-called experience, also consists of objects. So thoughts become objects, and feelings become objects. Anything that we can name becomes an object. And so we're very focused usually on thinking of objects, these discrete things that we can interact with as a subject. And this puts us in a position usually of feeling that we have to manage all of this stuff. And usually that ends up feeling not so good. Either we end up feeling overwhelmed or we feel scared. And so that's an objective view normally. Not that it's all bad. It's just that's has some downsides. Okay, so we've got usually a division between a subject and an object. So the sense is I'm the subject, there everything else is an object, and then there's this relating between the subject and object. So this basic threefold division exists in most of the things that most of our experience most of the time as we conceive of it and perceive it. So I think I'm the knower, there's an act of knowing, and there's what's known. Right, so the knower is the subject, the known is the object, and then there's this intermediary, which is the act of knowing. There's the one who is feeling, the feeler, I guess you could say. There's the feeling itself, and then there's the act of feeling. That's a confusing one to describe. There's the seer, there's the seen, and there's the act of seeing. So the basic division exists there. So this is, as I'm pointing out, this is the way most of us are trained to understand our experience. And so by default, we don't know that we're doing it, but this is how we go about our lives most of the time. So we usually have a division, a sense that there's this, I'm the subject, and then there's all the subjective stuff, and there's some kind of boundary between the two. And then I'm having to mediate that. And that mediation involves usually some kind of, usually there'll be some kind of protection that we perceive as needed to a certain extent, and then there'll be a certain kind of what would I call this? Kind of aggressive tendency. So there's one sense is a sense of trying to protect, trying to maintain the boundary from, so that the outside doesn't come and harm the inner, the subject. And then there's another, which is a desire to interact and modify or manipulate or control or manage the objective. And so there's sort of an aggressive tendency, to an outward aggressive tendency. So these are sort of two basic things that happen. Okay, so that's just to say this is the basic setup. Now, we want to be successful, right? This is usually our intention. We desire to be successful. But this basic setup poses some problems for us to be successful, because if I'm the subject and I'm trying to be in relationship successfully with this object or this objective reality, then there's always this dynamic that's needing to be managed of, as I've described, protection or aggression. And so that's quite a lot to try and manage. Particularly because the objective seems to be quite large. If you think about it, there doesn't seem to really be an end to the things that you can name. Even just in the, if you just were to look at the night sky, well, in a place where you could see the night sky, and you were to try and count the stars, you wouldn't be able to do it. Or if you tried to count all, the grains of sand at the beach, you couldn't do it. So just even to that extent, it becomes quite an enormous task to try and manage this relationship between the subjective and the objective. So, so we've got a problem in this regard, because we want to somehow be successful, but it all seems a bit much. So this is one of the major drawbacks of this way of viewing things. Now, remember that the principle that we're exploring is this law of correspondence. So the law of correspondence, again, suggests that there is a correspondence between in this case, we're exploring this division along the lines of subjective and objective, so that this objective and the subjective have a correspondence. So then one thing that this offers us is that it's a simplification. So I no longer have to be so concerned about this overwhelming volume of stuff, because I can now keep my focus on the correspondence. So noticing that there's just some sense that there's some kind of let's say a message that's available. There's some kind of intelligence that's communicating through this medium of the subjective and objective. So I'm not needing to focus so much on either, let's say, but instead I can start to keep my attention on the message that's expressing. There's an intelligence that's expressing, and it's expressing through this correspondence. So correspondence, meaning that there's what it's one thing to see. I've heard it. What did I hear this? How did I hear this put? That there's if something happens once, then it's how is this put? If it happens once, then something. If it happens twice, then maybe it's if it happens once, it's chance. If it happens twice, then it's a coincidence. If it happens 3 times, I don't remember what happened. If it happens 3 times, you pay attention, basically, is the idea. If it happens 3 times, then there's something to it. There's something there. It's not just you can blow it off the first time, the second time, but the third time, there's something there. And so it's like there's an intelligence that's communicating through our experience. And we could call this intuition also. So there's something that we can't quite grasp it with the rational mind, because the rational mind can only focus on the objective. It can only do objective. It can only grasp these discrete things, can only divide in that way. But there's something that emerges that's more holistic, that can't be quite grasped with the rational mind, and it comes through the intuition. And I would suggest that just to a large extent, this law of correspondence works through the intuition. So we really have to start to cultivate or open to our intuitive faculties in order to start to really benefit from this law of correspondence. So okay, so let's see, what do I want to say next? So most of the time, as I've proposed, we're going through our lives and we don't recognize that we're programmed in this particular way, to perceive in this particular way, but it's the way of the world at this time. And so it's very rare for a person not to be heavily influenced by this subject-object perspective. And it's usually so dominant that it completely dominates the entire experience for most people, to the extent that most people really can't even conceive of something else. And even if they can conceive of something else, it's usually very secondary. It's like the objective is accepted to be the reality, and then there's this other thing that's considered to be this very small thing that maybe one might play with. It might be cute, it might be interesting, it might be all these other things, but it's not really, it doesn't have a large place has a very small place, whereas the objective has a very large place in the consciousness. So this law of correspondence is saying that there's a relationship there, that when what we've divided somewhat arbitrarily, there's actually a relationship between the two or more dimensions that we've divided. And that when we're focused on these divisions, then we become completely overwhelmed, and it will make us inefficient and ineffective in ultimately in being successful. There's an expression which is divide and conquer. So if you're divided, then it's easy for you to be conquered. Conquered by what? Conquered by fear, anxiety, overwhelm, and these kinds of things. Because if you think about all of those things that we perceive to be the problems of our lives, they're not really problems per se. We only perceive them as problems because they seem to interfere with what it is that we want. Usually they interfere so much that a person doesn't even really know what they want, other than that they know that they want the absence of those things. They want the absence of the depression, or the absence of the pain, or the absence of the distress, but they don't know what it is that they really want. So this division within the consciousness has so successfully divided and conquered that many times people don't even know what they want. They're just reacting to what they don't want. And so the law of correspondence is a way, when we start to accept the law of correspondence, it's a way of beginning to heal that division. We start to see that what we have perceived as something separate actually is not separate, that there's some thread that runs throughout all of it that connects and unites all of it, and that we can begin to follow that and follow its trail, and that will actually lead us to more of a connection with what it is that we actually want, so that we can begin to have our focus on what we really want instead of having our focus on what we don't want. So practically speaking, because that's maybe all of that is interesting, maybe it's not interesting, maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't make sense, but none of that really gives a clear practical application of this. And that's where the rubber meets the road. So that's where it really matters, because as I have promised from the outset, the benefit of this is that it will help us to be more successful in our lives in achieving what we want. And so let's see if we can find a practical application of this that will actually give us benefit in our lives. Okay, so you can, some of you know that I have been enthusiastic over the years about the teachings of Thomas Hanna. For those who are not familiar, briefly, Thomas Hanna was a professor of philosophy, and he made the observation when he was traveling around the world at one time. He made the observation that wherever he was, he saw certain kinds of patterns in the way that the people in those places held themselves. So if he happened to be in Prague, for example, he noticed that there was a certain commonality among the people of Prague, broadly speaking, in terms of we could say posture, how they held themselves, how they appeared physically to hold themselves. And if, on the other hand, in Nairobi, there was a different commonality in the people. So the way that people held themselves in different places differed, but there would be a commonality, broadly speaking, in among the people of one area. And this was interesting to him, and he began to explore this and think about this. And what he came to was that this was a learned thing. That this was, people learned how to hold themselves, and furthermore, that the way in which people held themselves corresponded to certain beliefs, attitudes, and so forth. So there's a correspondence between the way in which the person is holding themselves physically, the types of tension they hold chronically, and their subjective, we could say subjective, maybe, experience of how they understand themselves. And then that would translate into things like maybe a sense of anxiety, or a sense of joviality, or a sense of ambition, these kinds of things. And so I'm one of the reasons I'm very attracted to the work of Hannah is because I also had made a very similar observation, not observing other people, but just observing myself many years ago. I observed that the way in which I was holding myself physically, the habits that I had, definitely corresponded to the types of thoughts that I was having, the types of feelings that I was having, and how I perceived myself in my world. And so I found, when I found Thomas Hanna, I found somebody who had thought about the same things, had made the same basic kind of observations, and had some suggestions as to some things that might be useful in terms of how to heal that. So we can do a little experiment inspired by Thomas Hanna. He proposed that there were these three basic, he called them reflexes, in the human organism. And for our purposes, we'll just explore two of them. The third is actually a combination of the first two anyway. So, but the first two are easier to experience. So he called them red light and green light. And let's see if we can experience them. So, assuming that it's appropriate and safe for you to do so presently, you can try this experiment. Round your shoulders and round your lower back, and keep looking forward. And just stay here for a moment. And just notice what this experience is. Just notice that you actually can sense that you're in this posture, and be curious about how you notice that you're in this posture. And then slowly release that so that you come back to something more neutral. And just notice the contrast of what you were, how you were just experiencing yourself, and how you're experiencing yourself now. So you'll notice they're different. And if it's not clear to you, which it might not be, because it takes quite a lot of exploration to get a lot of clarity around it, You might want to repeat that a few times. So you could just, again, round the shoulders. So you're just rolling the shoulders forward. You're just doing an internal rotation of the arms. And you're grounding the back. So you're sort of tucking the tailbone. And you're continuing to look forward. So just notice what that's like. So your chest is collapsed. Your abdomen is in a, I guess we could call that a contracted state. Back of your neck is making some effort. Perhaps you can feel all the way up the back of the skull, the scalp, and the forehead. You can probably feel it in how it affects your breathing. And then slowly release that. And see if you can just allow yourself to come to a more neutral position. But don't try and force it. Just actually give a moment to allow yourself to actually relax into a neutral position. See if that's possible. So you just notice the difference between the two states. That's the goal of this exercise. So that's what Hannah called a red light reflex. That it's a contraction along the front side of the body in the core of the body. And because we still want to maintain a forward focus, then we also have to contract in the back of the neck to keep the head looking forward. These days, a lot of people call this, what do they call this? It's part of what people will call a head forward posture. They call it by other names, or rounded shoulders, all these other things. But this is a basic pattern in the nervous system that Hannah identified. So if you think about if you were to be in that posture for a long period of time, how that might be. Hannah found that there was a correspondence, or is a correspondence, between that posture and a sense of fear, broadly speaking. We could call it fear. It's a withdrawal pattern. So if you notice what's happening there, the core is actually moving back in space. There's a withdrawal. So this part of our torso, the abdomen particularly, is somewhat vulnerable. And so this is actually a pattern that happens is when somebody is surprised, automatically they tend to do this because it's withdrawing this vulnerable part of the body, and so it becomes more protected. But if you were to stay in that posture for extended periods of time, and then if you were to forget consciously that you were even in that posture, then you would perhaps be experiencing the fear that corresponds to that objective state of that withdrawal pattern physically, but because it would have become normalized and sort of like white noise, your nervous system would forget that you're in that posture, but it would still be aware that you're experiencing the fear and anxiety and worry and apprehension and so forth and so on. So that's one. The other pattern is what Hannah calls the green light. So we can also test that out. So it's just sort of the opposite. So roll your pelvis forward. So this would be an anterior tilt of the pelvis. So you're tightening the back. So the back becomes contracted and shortened. The chest opens up, shoulders are coming back. And if you wanted to keep looking forward, you kind of have to tuck your chin a little bit. So just see if you hold this for a moment and just notice what this experience is. Just notice how you feel. Do you feel sleepy? Feel relaxed and like you're just ready to take a nap, or maybe do you feel more alert, ready to do stuff? And then slowly relax, come to neutral. So really let the backside relax. Notice that in order to hold that posture, you had to hold tension on the back. So you want to consciously release that. And avoid trying to pull yourself back into what you think is the right way of being, because the optimal way is probably not what you're accustomed to. So we're just wanting to relax whatever we were just doing so that we can come to a more neutral position. And then just notice what this is like, especially in contrast with how you were experiencing yourself just a moment ago. So clearly it's different. Has to be different because it's a different state. You know it's different. And a lot of the time we'll overlook this, but you can notice it now. And then you might want to do this again. So again, contracting the backside, letting the chest open, shoulders come back. And probably the chin has to tuck a little bit. Otherwise, your head's going to be also going back in space. So if you want to keep looking forward, you probably have to tuck your chin a little bit. And just notice what this experience is like. And then slowly release to a neutral position and notice how that is. So Hannah called this, what we were just doing, the green light reflex. So green light is the green mean in the US, at least, green means go. Red means stop, green means go. So hence the name's red light, green light. So the red light is the withdrawal, so stopping. So if you're afraid, you don't go forward, you stop, you withdraw. Green light, on the other hand, is really the opposite. This is, you're going to go, 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 go. So this green light gives more of this sort of aggressive tendency, this forward momentum that you're just going to go. You really can't actually stay in one spot so well when you're in that green light posture. You're really wanting to go forward in space. So the reason I have suggested we go through this little exercise is to see firsthand, have an experience of this law of correspondence. So you notice that when you enter into these different postures, that there's a corresponding sense of yourself. So Hannah proposed a system of exercises that can be done to help restore the nervous system's ability to properly detect muscular tension and to release that tension, and thereby helping to restore a more balanced state of the nervous system all around, which means also relieving the corresponding states of anxiety or hyperarousal in various ways. So this is interesting and it can be effective. However, if all one was to do those exercises somewhat mechanically, the results would be very limited. And if we want to be more, get better results from those exercises or just generally in life, then we could pay attention to the correspondence and notice that there is something that is being communicated to us through our experience. And there's an intelligence there that if we are willing to be receptive to it, it's communicating to us. And it's really pointing us exactly in the right direction that will help us to achieve success in our life. What do I mean by that? So if I'm experiencing this red light reflex chronically, so I'm chronically in this withdrawal state, which many people are, then well, okay, I'll just say this first. Okay, so if I'm chronically in this state, then I'm going to have experiences that are going to correspond to that state. So I might experience certain physical things that would alert me to that. I also might experience certain thought patterns, such as excessive worry, or I might experience certain types of emotional patterns like fear. So if I realize all of this, first of all, this is great. This is already I'm already benefiting from the law of correspondence if I start to notice these things. But I can really continue with allowing this intelligence to help me if I start to work with it in all of its aspects and help it all come together. So if I happen to realize I have some of these unwanted symptoms, and maybe I go to somebody who's trained in somatics, as an example, and they say, oh, you are exhibiting a red light pattern. Here's some exercises that you can do, and this will help you. So you could do those exercises. And if all you did was you said, well, I'm just going to do the exercises because this expert told me that I should do the exercises and that's going to fix me, then you're not going to get very excellent results because you're still trying to solve the problem while you're divided instead of allowing this law of correspondences to help you heal. It's worth noting that the root of the word heal has the same root as the word whole with a W-H-O-L-E. So that to heal means a restoration of wholeness. So if we're actually suffering from division, then the healing means to restore wholeness, to remedy the problem of the division. So if I'm trying to solve the problem, if I'm hoping that I can arrive at healing by focusing on a fractionated part, then I'm really going in the wrong direction. But if I allow the healing to happen through the law of correspondence, so I start to see, okay, the way that I'm holding myself also corresponds to these feelings. It also corresponds to these thoughts. Then what it's doing is it's helping me to see all of the threads that are part of this tapestry of the pain that I'm in, so that I can then tease that apart and return to this state of wholeness. So practically speaking, what I mean by this is that, and this is, I think, will be particularly valuable. This is, I think, valuable to everybody, but this will be because the example that I'm using relates to somatics. This will be particularly useful or insightful for those who are practicing somatics. When whatever you're doing, trying to help yourself, you can notice the intelligence that's communicating to you through the wholeness of your experience, and allow that to help you in releasing what the division that you don't want. So if you are, let's say you have some physical discomfort and you are hoping to resolve that physical discomfort by physical means, whatever that might be, through some sort of exercises or some sort of massage or body work, something of that sort, then just notice that actually for most people that doesn't give long-term satisfying results on its own. What will help is to be aware, as you're doing whatever else you're doing, of the wholeness of your experience, and to see that it all goes together, so that the certain thoughts or feelings that you have are not unrelated, but they're actually intimately corresponding to the whole of your experience. So if I have, let's say, abdominal discomfort, this is just an example, so don't take this to be diagnostic in your case, but as an example, if there's digestive or let's say abdominal discomfort, then maybe this is suggestive of some chronic tension in the abdomen. In other words, some red light reflex. So one way that we could help ourselves in this situation would be to use Hannah's approach. So we could consciously contract the abdomen and then very slowly, consciously release that tension. And repeating that with awareness over and over and over will slowly help the nervous system to regain awareness and voluntary control over that part of the body. So that's great. However, if there's a habit of fear and worry, then if I don't also observe and resolve the fear and worry, then what are the chances that this remedy is going to actually take hold and last It's not going to work, actually. I might get some temporary results. I might get some degree of relief, but I'm not going to get the total relief and the total satisfaction that I'm looking for, because it's not going to give me the totality of my experience. It's not going to give me confidence in myself and my ability to experience my life in a uh, successful way. So what I want to do then is I want to be aware of these other things. So as I'm releasing the abdomen, I'm going to notice that I'm feeling things. Probably I'm going to notice that I'm feeling vulnerable. And I might notice then that I have certain thoughts, anxious thoughts, worrisome thoughts. So I need to, in order to allow the law of correspondence to help bring actual healing, again, a restoration of wholeness, then I need to pay attention to those things and allow for the healing to be inclusive of those things, so that everything, again, comes together instead of being divided, because they were never separate. It was only in my thinking or in my imagination that they were separate. So, and this doesn't have to, this could work from any one of the seeming parts. It doesn't have to start with the physical. It could start with the emotional. It could start with the mental. So meaning maybe first I just notice that I'm having these certain anxious thoughts. Maybe that's where my attention more easily goes. So I just notice these thoughts. So I could slow down the thoughts, just notice that I can allow more space there. And if I just relax my breathing, this helps. So I can notice, okay, if I just relax my breathing, I can allow more space. And so there, maybe those thoughts are still there, but there's a little bit more space. It's a little more slowed down. So this is starting to move in a direction of healing. But if that's all I do, then I'm missing the other parts. So I'm not paying attention to the physical or the emotional. So even though I could do that as a technique temporarily, it might give me some relief. Maybe I learn to do box breathing, or I learn to do some kind of mental technique or something that shifts my thinking or my experience of my thinking short term. That gives me short term results. And that's great, but it's not enough to give real healing, because there's a big difference between temporary fix and actual healing. So if I allow myself to trust in the law of correspondence, then I start to see, okay, it's all connected. So as I'm allowing this space in my thoughts, let me just notice what else is here. What am I feeling? How am I physically? And then to notice that each of those other aspects of my experience also is providing useful information, that there's knowledge and intelligence that's operating here, that's pointing me in the direction of healing. Now, chances are it's going to be, let's say, challenging. It's not going to be, there's a certain momentum, or there's a habit of behaving in a certain way or reacting in a certain way. And because that's familiar, even if it may be dysfunctional or painful or destructive, because it's familiar, the temptation is to continue with what's familiar. So even though holding physical tension is not actually comfortable, if it's habitual, then it may be, at first, it seems easier just to hold the tension. and it seems difficult to release the tension. And similarly with them, if having anxious thoughts is not a comfortable or nice experience, but if it's what's familiar, then at first it's much easier, or seems much easier, to continue to indulge those anxious thoughts than it is to learn how to release the anxious thoughts. But using this law of correspondence, we can actually allow bit by bit for everything to be restored to wholeness instead of this artificial division. Because in the artificial division, individually, these various aspects, because of the habit, they seem like it's easier to maintain them than it is to let them come apart. But it's a bit like centrifugal force. So if there's a momentum to something when it seems divided, so you think there's this amusement park ride, if you can imagine such a terrible thing, where that uses centrifugal force, centrifugal, some one of the two. It's either with an F or a P, one of those. And so the people get into the ride, which consists of this room, a round room that can spin around really fast. And the people go to the wall of the round room, and then the thing starts spinning round and round and round and round and round really, really fast. And because of the force, the people are pinned against the wall, and then the floor drops out. But they stay pinned against the wall, even though they're not standing on anything. And then the floor comes back up, and then it slows down, and then everybody vomits. And I'm feeling unwell just thinking about it. But this is what I'm getting at, is that when there's a certain force because of the momentum, when actually there's wholeness, but because we're in the habit of sensing that there's a division, then these aspects of our experience are pinned against the wall, as it were. And so it seems easier because of the momentum and because of that force to just keep indulging the particular way of thinking, and this particular way of feeling, and this particular way of holding the body. But when we realize this is a terrible way of living and we don't want to do it anymore, and we are willing to allow the law of correspondence to help bring healing, then instead of continuing to imagine this artificial division, we let them be brought together as they really are. And maybe there's a period, sorry to say it, maybe there's a period for a little bit in which there's a sense of nausea because you've just been spinning around for a while, maybe for many years, decades, who knows, for a long time, perhaps, with this artificial division. But now, as the proper sense of wholeness is being restored, at first there's an adaptation. We have to reacclimate to that proper state. And so because of that, there can be a certain discomfort that's initially there, but we have to be willing to persist, even though that may be the case. And so that's what I'd like to say. That's not true. I was going to say that's what I'd like to say about the law of correspondence. That's not at all what I'd like to say about the law of correspondence. I'd really like to say something very much more intelligent and elegant than all of that. But that's what I have said about the law of correspondence, complete with illustration from a terrible amusement park ride, which maybe will stay in your mind and be useful to you. And maybe it will just make you feel very nauseous for the rest of the day. I don't know. Hopefully the former and not the latter. So let's see. Have I at least said something there that was somewhat coherent? Probably not. So, but we'll leave it at that for today. And for those who are here live, I'm happy to stay on for Q&A. And for everybody else who's not here live, then this is the end for today.